In less than 10 seconds, the meticulously curated illusion of Camilla's absolute supremacy was shattered by a single, towering canvas suspended in a gilded frame. It did not happen with a fiery confrontation in the drawing rooms of Windsor Castle, nor was it the result of a vicious tabloid leak. It happened in complete suffocating silence during what was supposed to be a final walkthrough of the state apartments before a major diplomatic reception. What Camilla realized behind closed doors as her eyes locked onto a newly installed, breathtakingly prominent portrait of Diana, Princess of Wales, was that her 3-decade campaign of historical erasure had just been brutally dismantled. This is the story of a secret psychological power grab a flawlessly executed institutional retaliation by Prince William, and the staggering realization that while Camilla may wear the crown, she will never control the memory of the crown. This video will unpack the deeply psychological warfare hidden within the curation of the British monarchy, and the staggering institutional desperation driving Camilla's obsession with legacy. We will look at how she attempted to use her newfound authority to permanently banish Diana's image and artifacts into the darkest corners of the royal archives, how Prince William uncovered the curatorial paper trail, and the silent, ruthless visual humiliation that followed. What looked like a routine historical rotation by the Royal Collection Trust was actually the total dismantling of Camilla's manufactured narrative. That detail matters, because in the aristocratic world, the walls of the palace speak. And when you lose control of the walls, you lose control of the future. To comprehend the sheer emotional and institutional brutality of this checkmate, you must first understand the towering illusion of power Camilla had constructed over 30 agonizing years. She had played the longest, most heavily criticized game of psychological public relations in modern history. Her transformation from the most reviled woman in Britain to the crowned queen consort was a masterclass in slow burn manipulation. And standing on the balcony of Buckingham Palace on Coronation Day, she truly believed she had won the final definitive victory. She had the king, she had the title, she had the global stage. In her mind, the towering, unmanageable legacy of Diana had finally been paved over. Relegated to history books and 1990s documentaries, she believed she had Charles completely isolated and managed. Convinced that her proximity to the monarch gave her absolute authority over the aesthetic and historical narrative of the royal palaces. She felt entirely untouchable. During this post-coronation high, a quiet but incredibly ambitious shift began within the administrative offices of Clarence House and the curatorial departments of the royal estates. Camilla understood a fundamental, terrifying truth about her position. While she had captured the apex of social triumph, her presence in the royal timeline is fundamentally viewed as an interruption. She's a second wife with no biological connection to the future king, unlike the Spencer family whose bloodline will sit on the throne for generations. Camilla's legacy relies almost entirely on suppressing the ghost of the woman she replaced. This created a staggering institutional desperation. She needed to permanently scrub the palace of Diana's lingering presence before Charles's reign inevitably concluded. Her strategy was a creeping, methodical erasure of historical artifacts. In the monarchy, power is visually demonstrated by whose portraits hang in the primary staterooms, whose jewels are worn at state banquets, and whose memory is preserved in the active life of the court. What appears to be true based on sudden shifts in curatorial directives and archive management early in the new reign is that Camilla quietly ordered the long-term storage of specific paintings, busts, and photographic collections heavily associated with Diana. She attempted to relegate the most iconic pieces of the late princess's legacy to the climate-controlled vaults, far away from the eyes of visiting dignitaries and the public. She was trying to build an impenetrable historical fortress, assuming that the king's blind devotion would shield this staggering cultural overreach from any internal scrutiny. She attempted to weave her own narrative into the very fabric of the royal walls, replacing Diana's memory with newly commissioned portraits of herself and carefully placed tributes to her own non-royal family. She thought she was editing the institutional memory of the British state. She believed the curatorial system would blindly obey the king and by extension obey her. But she fatally underestimated the quiet, analytical ruthlessness of the man who actually owns the future. Prince William does not operate on reckless emotion. He does not care about public relations spin or the psychological coddling of his father's wife. William operates with a deeply ingrained understanding of institutional warfare, heavily influenced by watching his mother suffer at the hands of the palace machine. Furthermore, as the Prince of Wales, William holds immense undeniable influence over the Royal Collection Trust, the charity that manages the monarchy's priceless art and artifacts. He is not merely a resident of the palaces, he is the active guardian of their history. William did not have to actively spy on Camilla. The administrative footprint simply crossed the desks of his senior staff. During routine reviews of the Royal Collection's upcoming exhibition schedules and stateroom preparations, William and his fiercely loyal curatorial advisors analysed the archive directives. They were looking for anomalies, they were looking for protocol deviations, and they found them. The paper trail exposed the quiet, systematic removal of Diana's most significant portraits. It laid bare the sheer audacity of Camilla's attempt to seamlessly erase the mother of the future king from the visual record of the sovereign spaces. This is where the story pivots from a quiet power grab into a masterclass of psychological retaliation. A lesser royal might have marched into the king's study, slammed the inventory lists on the desk, and demanded that his mother's paintings be returned. He might have leaked the curatorial memos to the press to publicly shame the queen consort. But William possesses the cold precision of a future monarch. He knew that confronting Charles would only trigger his father's defensive rage and victimize Camilla. He chose a path far more devastating. He chose a silent administrative execution. The retaliation was completely silent. Utilizing his absolute authority and influence within the Royal Collection Trust, William simply initiated a sweeping, immediate standardization of historical preservation across the primary state apartments. He mandated that in preparation for the upcoming diplomatic season, the palaces must visually reflect the unbroken continuity of the immediate line of succession. It was framed publicly as a necessary, deeply respectful curation of the crown's modern history, a completely standard alignment with the trust's educational mandate. By enforcing this flawless administrative logic, William quietly and instantly invalidated Camilla's archive directives. The curatorial system was updated overnight, no warnings were issued to Clarence House, no dramatic family meetings were held. The artwork rotation schedules were simply rewritten by the trust's directors and the vaults were opened. When the trap finally snapped shut, it was a moment of profound, paralyzing visual humiliation for Camilla. She walked into the primary reception room expecting to see the carefully sanitized, Diana-free environment she had secretly orchestrated. Instead, her breath caught in her throat. Commanding the room, positioned in a place of undeniable prominence and perfectly illuminated by the gallery lights, was a magnificent full-scale portrait of Diana. The deeply apologetic, perfectly polite curatorial staff stood nearby arranging the final touches. They did not insult Camilla. They simply explained with the immovable cold courtesy of the British state that there had been a routine update to the stateroom curation to reflect the direct lineage of the Prince of Wales. They informed the Queen Consort that the Royal Collection Trust had determined this specific placement was historically essential for the upcoming diplomatic tours. When the realization hit Camilla, it must have been suffocating. The entire maneuver was wrapped in the impenetrable language of historical preservation and curatorial independence. There was no personal attack for her to defend against. William had merely enforced the undeniable truth of the bloodline, and in doing so had completely humiliated Camilla's attempt at historical erasure. She was completely trapped. She could not publicly complain about Diana's portrait being displayed without exposing her own staggering insecurity and her secret attempt to banish the mother of the heir. She could not scream that she was being bullied because the actions taken by the trust were legally flawless and culturally unassailable. The illusion of her absolute power shattered against the cold, hard reality of a canvas she could not touch. In a state of sudden, deep panic, realizing her manufactured history had just been publicly dismantled by her stepson, she had only one desperate option left. She had to find the king. When Camilla retreated from the state apartments and entered the king's private study, she was armed with the sharp, panicked indignation of a woman who had just watched her legacy evaporate. She brought the curatorial updates directly to Charles, fully expecting the man who had waged a 30-year war against the British establishment for her sake to once again fly into a protective, unyielding rage. For decades, Charles's overwhelming guilt over her public vilification had been her ultimate shield. She expected him to immediately summon the directors of the Royal Collection Trust, override the Prince of Wales, and demand that the portrait of Diana be returned to the dark, climate-controlled vaults from which it came. But as the king reviewed the flawlessly polite, historically bulletproof exhibition mandates issued by his son's curatorial team, he did not reach for the telephone. He did not summon Prince William for a reprimand. He looked at the paperwork. He looked at his breathless wife and he offered a devastating hollow silence. This was the psychological climax of her decades-long campaign for absolute supremacy. Charles, the man she had molded and managed, refused to save her narrative, and the reason why exposes the brutal reality of their new dynamic. Charles is no longer the rebel prince fighting a romanticized war for his mistress. He is an aging monarch burdened by a fragile institution, heavily dependent on the surging global popularity of William and Catherine to keep the crown relevant. More importantly, Charles understands the deadly trap William had set by framing the portrait's installation as an undeniable requirement for historical continuity and diplomatic protocol. William had made it impossible for the king to intervene without triggering a catastrophic public relations crisis. If Charles ordered the palace staff to take down a magnificent painting of the mother of the future king, simply to soothe the ego of his second wife, the leak to the press would be instantaneous and fatal to his reign. Faced with the choice between indulging his wife's desperate need for historical erasure and maintaining the stable, dignified image of the crown, Charles chose the crown. He chose survival. For Camilla, that silence was a death blow. It was the moment the velvet drape was pulled back, exposing the staggering vulnerability of her position. You have to understand the depth of this institutional and commercial desperation. Camilla is queen consort, but she is essentially a glittering tenant, surrounded by walls she does not own, filled with art she cannot control. She does not own Buckingham Palace, she does not command the Royal Collection Trust. And now she realized she could not even dictate the visual environment of the room she operates in. If she outlives Charles, her reality becomes incredibly precarious. She will be a queen dowager reliant entirely on the goodwill of a new King William. A man who has just proven he possesses the tactical ruthlessness to dismantle her manufactured history with a single canvas. She has no ancestral estates to retreat to that rival the royal properties. She possesses no independent billionaire fortune to commission her own legacy. The illusion of her absolute power evaporated the moment she realized she was wearing borrowed jewels in a borrowed house, staring up at a painting hung by a stepson who silently despises what she represents. This curatorial exile was only the first phase of the institutional reckoning. With Camilla's historical narrative permanently shattered, William and Catherine began to silently, methodically assert control over the deeper symbolic power of the monarchy. If the portrait was the structural blow, what happened later that evening at the diplomatic reception was the ultimate visual humiliation. As the doors opened for the reception, the guests naturally gravitated toward the primary stateroom, their eyes immediately drawn to the commanding illuminated presence of Diana looking down from the walls. Camilla was forced to host the evening operating directly beneath the shadow of the woman she'd spent her life trying to erase. She was visually reduced to a temporary custodian, a secondary figure in her own supposed triumph. But that is where the story changes, because Catherine did not just attend the reception. She arrived with the effortless, devastating gravity of a true future queen, and she weaponized the visual hierarchy perfectly. Catherine entered the room wearing the iconic Cambridge Lover's Knot tiara and the heavy pearl and sapphire choker famously favored by Diana. She did not stand near Camilla. She positioned herself across the room, directly aligning herself with the portrait of her late mother-in-law. This was not a coincidence. It was a masterclass in spatial and historical restoration. The visual continuity was undeniable. The guests, the cameras, and the courtiers saw the past and the future of the crown perfectly aligned, communicating a single unbreakable bloodline. Camilla, standing across the room in her newly minted crown, was entirely boxed out of the narrative. William and Catherine were silently restoring the boundaries Camilla had spent 3 decades trying to blur. By utilizing the cold machinery of palace curation and protocol, William and Catherine forced Camilla into a purely ceremonial corner. They allowed her to keep the title, the balcony appearances, and the carriage rides, because stripping her of those would publicly damage the king. But beneath the surface, they had entirely locked her out of the institutional memory. This is the ultimate contrast of Schadenfreude. To the casual observer watching a royal procession, Camilla appears to have reached the absolute zenith of human ambition. She is the queen. But behind the heavy wooden doors of the palaces, she is a woman acutely aware that her power is utterly hollow. She's flanked by courtiers who answer to William. She is surrounded by historical artifacts managed by William. She is staring at a future dictated by a family that will never truly allow her to overwrite their history. The story of the portrait trap is not just a tale of petty royal jealousy. It is a brilliant demonstration of institutional warfare. It shows how the truly powerful do not need to scream leak to the tabloids or throw public tantrums to destroy an adversary. They simply use the bureaucratic machinery already in place. They weaponize the archives, they enforce the protocol, and they let the walls do the talking. Prince William did not just protect a painting, he protected the fundamental integrity of the crown's history from being quietly rewritten by someone who had no right to hold the pen. He delivered a silent, perfectly executed checkmate. Camilla finally achieved the crown she spent her whole life chasing, only to realize that the institution she fought so hard to conquer will never truly belong to her. If you found this forensic breakdown of royal power dynamics compelling, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an analysis of the hidden machinery driving the world's most secretive institutions.